All right, I'm going to show you a little trick. So again, I'm having a hard time getting it to pinpoint exactly where I want it to start quilting. It thinks that my quilt is way over here when it's, or it thinks my quilt is right here when it's really way over here. So what I'm going to do is, when I realign my safe area, I'm going to say reposition on the screen. I'm going to move my crosshairs right to the corner of where it thinks my quilt is and tell the machine, this is actually where my quilt is. So now that I have my crosshairs in the corner of the quilt on the screen, it matches the fact that it's in the corner of the quilt on the frame, actually the way that it is on the frame. So I feel better about that. I'm going to go ahead and start setting my design up. So I'm going to double click my little roses to put them on the screen, and I'm going to just kind of take my finger and drag it a little bit outside of the corners where I want it. But the next thing I want to do is figure out what size do I want to make that design. So let's take a look at our quilt area. Let me grab that tape measure that I had earlier. And let's take a look at what we're comfortable with as far as our quilt area. So let me pull this out. And if I put my tape measure into my quilt area, I can see that I have about 14 inches that I'm comfortable quilting. I actually could go outside a little bit because I can make the design bigger. So if I go up to like where the top of my batting is, I really can comfortably do about 15 inches. And I want that design to be a 15-inch design. And we're going to trim. We're going to trim the outside border. So if I put the design outside of the borders of my quilt and trim it, 15 inches should work just fine for the design size. I don't want to go any bigger than that because I can't get too close to my frame here. It's going to warn me that I don't have enough room to quilt at that size. So let's go over here on this design that I picked out, and we're going to hit the resize button, and I want to resize it with the keypad, and I want to resize this second number, and I want it to maintain the ratio of the design. So I don't want to resize just part of it and elongate it. So I'm going to tell it, give me 15 inches. And see how much bigger it made the design. So now it's 15 by 24. So I've got 15-inch design this way, 24-inch design that way. And I'm happy with that. So now to do an edge-to-edge quilting, I need to just hit the E2E plus button as many times for it to go all the way across my quilt. And I'll zoom out a little bit so you can see that. So now I've got the design, will fit in my quilt. I can trim it. It will fit within my safe area. I'm not going past my safe area. And I'm going outside the perimeters of my quilt, and I like the way that looks. So now the next thing I need to do is replicate that down the entire size of my quilt. I hit the full view so it brings everything into focus. Now I'm going to hit the multiply button one time, and I'm going to hit multiply down one, and now look at it. But you see there's spacing between those two rows, and I don't like that much spacing in there. So I'm going to reduce the spacing by hitting this little down, arrow that's like this where it crunches. Hit it one time, and just watch, I'm going to hit it again and move the spacing between those rows until I'm happy. I'm kind of happy with that. I think that's fairly close. That's even better. So I kind of like it like that. So now that I've got the spacing set, I'm going to come over here and hit the down button again, and it should maintain the same spacing until I fill the entire quilt with design. And I'll zoom out so you can see. So now my entire quilt is filled with this design. I can adjust it, and I'm happy with that. So to start sewing just the first row, I only want to work with the first row. So I'm going to unconnect the designs. So every one of these rows is independent of the other. And when you touch them and it highlights them in red, you can see that each row is independent. So the first row is the one I want to work with. I'm going to go to my sew options. I'm going to make sure it decues everything. There's nothing in the queue to be quilted. Now I'm going to select this first row and tell it to cue that row. That's the row I want to sew. But before I can sew it, I've got to trim that design that's outside the parameters of my quilt. So I'm going to come over here to trim. Oh, first I got to select it. So to select it to turn it red. go to trim. Let's trim the horizontal first, which is the top line. And I will need to hit invert because I'm going to trim everything to the top. If I don't hit invert, it's going to trim everything to the bottom. We don't want to trim the bottom, we want to trim the top. So now I can just select that top dark line, which is the top of my quilt. It turns it black. And, well, if I quit clicking on it, get it where I want it, there we go. I hit the check mark and it erases that top line. Now we need to trim our vertical. So let's go to trim again. We're going to do the vertical and the same thing. If I want to trim anything to the left, I have to hit invert. Click on the edge of my quilt, click the check, and delete that. Now I'm going to trim the right side. So I don't hit the invert. I just click the edge of my quilt, hit the check mark, and it trims it. Now we're ready to actually start sewing our design. I'm not going to trim the other rows. I'll do them as I get to them, so that way I don't lose my place. In the grand scheme of things, it really doesn't matter. Your quilt, when you roll your quilt up and you tell it you're on row 2, it doesn't really know you're on row 2. You could actually select row 3. It wouldn't really matter. It's gonna sew wherever you tell it to sew. It doesn't know when you rolled your quilt up. It doesn't know exactly where you are. This is just kind of to help you get an idea of what your quilt is going to look like when it's sewn and when it's finished. Someone asked earlier about, I got to the end of my quilt and realized I needed another row and I didn't have it. What do I do? Well, you would just pretend that that last row you finished was your next row. When you roll your quilt up, you just requilt that last row across your bottom and you're set to go. Because again, the machine doesn't know where the quilt is. It just knows what row you're telling it to sew on. I don't know if that makes any sense or not. We could test that and I could kind of show you what I mean by skipping a row and just repeating, like when I get ready to do the second row and the third row. Maybe when I do the third row, I'll tell it we're doing the second row again when we're really doing the third row. The machine's not going to know the difference. Really doesn't matter. But anyway, enough about that. Let's hit the start button and see if I get any warnings. Nope, we are good to go. So now I can tell it, I want to start at the start point. You only use start at closest point on design when you have a thread break or a bobbin that runs out, which we're going to experience because I'm going to show you. So when that happens, I'm going to show you how to reset your design and have it start stitching exactly where your thread broke. It's very easy. So let's go to start. Now let's watch the machine. It's going to move itself into position. It does all the work for you. When the screen comes on, all right, it just slightly moved because we're really close to our start point. So now that it's ready to sew, this is what my screen looks like. I need to pull up my bobbin thread. And I want my top thread on the underside of my foot. So I'm going to accomplish both of those at the same time. So I'm going to toggle my switch, pull up my bobbin, and we'll take my finger and rake it underneath there to grab that top thread and bring it down and pull my bobbin thread up. So I have, and I missed the bobbin thread. So let's do it again. So I have the top thread underneath, but I accidentally missed my bobbin thread. Let's pull it again, pull the top thread, to bring up the bobbin, which it didn't do again. Remember how I told you? You just keep doing that step. For some reason, I'm missing the bobbin. It is not wanting to come up. Okay, so this is where I told you. You might have to move the machine out of the way. So we're going to have to stop. So we're going to stop. Let me move the machine forward and figure out what's going on with my bobbin thread. Open the bobbin case. See, I'm glad when things like this happen because then I can show you exactly what I'm talking about. So see, there's my bobbin thread. For some reason, it's not wanting to pull it up. So I'm going to pull some of it out, make sure it's moving correctly, trim it off, put it back in, bring the machine back over to the quilt. Now we've got to reset it again. We're going to tell it we're ready to quilt at the start point. Let it move back into position at the start point. It takes it just a second to think about it. There it goes. Now let's see if we can bring that bobbin thread up. Needle down and up. Sweep. And this time we got it. Yay! All right, now I'm going to hang on to both of these threads. I keep my scissors handy right here, and I just keep them on the edge of the thing for the handles. And I'm going to hit the, if you can see up here on the screen, the green check will start the machine, and it will start quilting. And there it goes. So once it starts, I can trim off those threads and then let it do its thing. Alright, I'm going to stop the video from here and let the machine run until the bobbin runs out, and then I'll come back and show you how to fix that.